The lights inside the grand hall were so bright that they made every face look sharper, every movement heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Hundreds of people sat waiting for the evening's conversation to begin, and the air was thick with the kind of anticipation that can only come when the most powerful leaders and the most brilliant minds gather in one place. Cameras were lined up like silent soldiers, their red lights blinking, ready to capture every second, ready to push it out into the world. On stage, just behind the curtains, Sundar Pichai stood quietly, his hands folded in front of him. He was calm, but inside his heart was beating faster than usual. Tonight was not just another conference. Tonight was different. The host had announced that India's Prime Minister would be speaking, and that Sundar, the CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the world, would be sharing the stage with him. For Sundar, this was more than a public event. It was personal. He had grown up in Chennai in a modest house where his father worked long hours so Sundar could study. His childhood had been filled with simple joys but also struggles. The sight of his father saving money for months just to buy a refrigerator or a phone had shaped him. And now, to stand next to the leader of the country that had given him his roots, it meant something that words could not fully capture. The crowd grew restless. People murmured. The curtains shifted. Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and reminded himself of what his father once told him. Respect is not given because of titles. Respect is shown through actions. Those words had guided him through every stage of his life. Tonight, he would need them more than ever. When the curtain finally opened, the applause hit like a wave. Prime Minister Modi walked to the center, raising his hand slightly, his face calm but focused. Sundar followed, smiling softly, his eyes scanning the audience. He could see students, business leaders, journalists, and ordinary citizens who had been invited to witness history. It was not just India watching. It was the world. The host welcomed them both and began asking questions. At first, everything seemed normal. The questions were about technology, innovation, India's role in the digital world. Sundar spoke thoughtfully, explaining how he believed technology should be used to empower people, not control them. Modi spoke with confidence about India's vision of becoming a global leader in technology, a nation that respected tradition while embracing change. But then, something happened that nobody expected. A man in the audience stood up. He was dressed, casually, with a sharp look in his eyes, and without waiting for the host to acknowledge him, he shouted, "Mr. Modi, you speak of progress, but what about the people who are left behind? What about the voices you silence? Do you even deserve this respect on stage?" The room froze. The air turned cold. People gasped. Some tried to shush him. Others pulled out their phones to record. The host looked panicked, unsure whether to call security or let the moment play out. Prime Minister Modi's face remained steady, but his silence stretched like a shadow, and Sundar felt his chest tighten. He knew what disrespect looked like. He knew what anger sounded like. But he also knew what it meant to hold yourself together in the middle of fire. The man continued, "You talk about technology, but do you even understand how it feels to be powerless? You stand here like a king, but you don't see the struggles of ordinary people. Why should we listen to you?" The words cut through the hall. The silence that followed was painful. Everyone was waiting for Modi to respond, but before he could, Sundar took a small step forward. His voice was steady, soft but strong enough to carry through the hall. "I grew up in a family where we did not always have enough," Sundar said, his eyes not on the protester but on the crowd. "I know what it means to feel small, to feel unheard. But I also know something else. I know that respect is not about agreeing with someone all the time. Respect is about listening, even when you disagree. Respect is about understanding that behind every voice, there is a human being." The hall was silent again, but this time it was different. The anger that had filled the air only moments before seemed to soften. The protester looked at Sundar, his mouth open but his words lost. "Leaders are not perfect," Sundar continued, his tone growing more intense. "But disrespect shouted in anger closes doors instead of opening them. If we want to build something better, we have to start with respect. Because without respect, even truth can be lost in noise. He turned, very gently, toward Modi. And respect does not mean blind praise. It means we give space for dialogue without destroying the dignity of each other. The crowd shifted, their eyes following Sundar, their hearts leaning toward his words. People who had been ready for conflict now found themselves reflecting. Modi nodded slightly, his expression calm but touched. The host exhaled, relieved. But the protester was not done. He shook his head. Easy for you to say, Sundar. You live in America now. You run a giant company. You don't know what it's like anymore to be powerless in India. The words struck Sundar like a stone, but he did not flinch. Instead, memories of his past rushed back. The crowded streets of Chennai, the nights when power cuts plunged his home into darkness, the hours he spent reading by the weak light of a kerosene lamp, the rejection letters he had once received when he dreamed of studying abroad, the times when he felt invisible. He spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost like he was speaking to himself as much as to the man. Power is not measured by where you live or what company you lead. Power is measured by how you treat people when you could choose to ignore them. And if I ever forget what it means to be powerless, then I have failed. The hall erupted into applause, not the wild cheering of entertainment, but the deep applause of people who felt something stir inside them. The protester looked around, his confidence shaken, his eyes darting between Modi, Sundar, and the audience. But just when it seemed like the moment had settled, a different voice rang out. This time it came from the back of the hall, louder, angrier, almost desperate. If respect is so important, Sundar, then answer me this. What will you do when respect is not returned? What will you do when kindness is met with cruelty? The question cut through the applause, silencing it in seconds. Sundar turned, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in focus. He knew this was no longer just about the Prime Minister. This was bigger. This was about every person who had ever struggled between kindness and cruelty, between humility and pride. And in that moment, with the cameras still rolling, with the world still watching, Sundar realized he had to go deeper than he ever had before. When kindness meets cruelty. The hall was still heavy with silence after the unexpected voice from the back cut through the applause. Sundar Pichai's words had touched many, but now the air was shifting again, pulled by a new challenge. The man who spoke was older, his voice carrying not just anger, but pain. People turned their heads, trying to catch a glimpse of his face. He stood tall, his hands clenched, his eyes burning with a question that pierced deeper than the first protest ever could. You say respect matters, Sundar, the man repeated, his voice shaking with emotion. But tell me this, what will you do when you give kindness and receive cruelty in return? What will you do when you bow in humility, and someone spits on that humility? Is respect still the answer then? The words stung the hall. They were not shouted in blind rage. They came from a place that everyone recognized, the place of betrayal, of disappointment, of wounds that had not healed. It was not just a question for Sundar. It was a question for every person in that hall, and for everyone watching around the world. Sundar's heart grew heavier. He had faced criticism before, about his company, his decisions, his leadership. But this was different. This was not about policies or profits. This was about the very core of how human beings treat each other. And in that moment he felt the weight of not only his own life, but the lives of countless others who had struggled between kindness and cruelty. He looked at the man, and in his mind scenes from his own life played out like an old film. The times when he had helped classmates in school, only to be mocked for his accent or his simplicity. The moments at Stanford when his ideas were dismissed, not because they lacked value, but because his voice was quiet, not loud. Even after becoming CEO, he had walked into rooms where his calm demeanor was mistaken for weakness, and he had learned that humility often gets tested in the harshest ways. Instead of answering quickly, Sundar paused. He let the silence grow until it became almost unbearable. People leaned forward in their seats, waiting, holding their breath. Finally, he spoke, his tone low but strong. carrying the weight of someone who had lived the question being asked. There was a time, Sundar began, when I believed that kindness would always be returned, but life taught me otherwise. There were days when I gave my best and it was not enough. There were people I treated with respect who treated me with disdain. And for a long time, I asked myself, why continue? Why not meet cruelty with cruelty? Disrespect with disrespect, after all, isn't that what the world expects? He stopped for a moment, letting his words sink in. Some in the audience nodded, their own memories of betrayal rising to the surface. But then, Sundar continued, his voice thick with emotion, I realized something. When I let cruelty change me, when I let it turn me bitter, then I have already lost. Cruelty is a chain. Once it catches you, it binds you. And the only way to break free is to choose differently. To choose kindness not because the world deserves it, but because you refuse to let cruelty define who you are. The older man's eyes flickered. The fire still there, but now mixed with something else. Recognition, perhaps even doubt. Sundar kept speaking. When respect is not returned, it hurts. When kindness is mocked, it wounds. But I ask you, what is the alternative? If we answer cruelty with cruelty, then we build a world of endless war. But if even one person chooses respect in the face of disrespect, kindness in the face of cruelty, then we build a bridge where before there was only fire. And maybe that bridge will not always be crossed. Maybe it will be ignored. But one day, someone will walk across it, and when they do, the world changes. The hall was utterly silent. The camera zoomed in on Sundar's face, capturing the raw honesty in his eyes. He was not giving a speech polished for applause. He was speaking like a man opening his heart in front of strangers. The older man shook his head, but his voice was softer now. Easy words for a powerful man, he said. But what about the powerless? What about those who give kindness every day and only receive pain? What about the millions who are crushed no matter how much they respect, no matter how much they endure? This question dug even deeper. Sundar felt his chest tighten, because he knew, truly knew, the truth of it. Not everyone who chooses kindness sees results. Not everyone who chooses humility is lifted up. Sometimes cruelty wins. Sometimes disrespect shouts louder. And yet, something inside him told him that this was not the end of the answer. He thought back to his mother, who had always been gentle but firm, who had told him that every act of kindness plants a seed, even if you never see it grow. He thought back to his teachers who had treated him with dignity when others ignored him, shaping the man he would become. And he realized that while cruelty can crush, respect can also echo across time in ways unseen. I cannot promise, Sundar said, slowly, that the kindness will always win. I cannot promise that respect will always be returned. But I can promise this. Cruelty destroys even those who wield it. It leaves emptiness behind. But kindness, even when it fails in the moment, leaves something that survives. A memory, a lesson, an example. Sometimes that is enough to change a life years later. Sometimes that is enough to heal what we thought could never be healed. The man lowered his gaze. His hands, once clenched, now loosened slightly. And in the audience, people began whispering, not with criticism, but with reflection. Sundar's words were not perfect answers, but they were true. And yet, before the hall could fully absorb this moment, another interruption came. This time, it was not a question. It was a sudden movement. A group of 3 young people stood up almost in unison, their expressions determined, their voices sharp. One of them pointed directly at Modi. Respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. If leaders want respect, let them show humility first. The hall broke into chaos. Some clapped, some booed, others shouted for order. Security moved closer, uncertain whether to intervene. Modi remained still, his expression unreadable, while Sundar felt the storm rising again. And in that storm, Sundar knew he had to decide. Should he defend Modi directly, risking alienating the young voices in front of him? Or should he challenge them, showing that respect was not a one-way street? He took a breath, ready to step forward. But just as he opened his mouth, something unexpected happened. Modi himself slowly rose from his chair, turning toward the young voices, his eyes steady, his face calm. The hall went silent again. Every camera turned. Every heart pounded. What Modi was about to say next would either heal the room or break it completely. When a leader finally spoke, the silence inside the hall was so deep it felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. The three young people who had risen from their seats stood stiff, their eyes locked on Prime Minister Modi, their voices still echoing in the minds of everyone present. Their challenge hung in the air like a blade. Respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. All eyes turned toward Modi. Even Sundar Pichai, who had been holding the weight of the moment, found himself waiting, uncertain of what the Prime Minister would do. For years, people had seen Modi speak with confidence. Sometimes with fire, sometimes with steel. But this was different. This was not a rally filled with cheering supporters. This was not a press conference where prepared words could carry the day. This was raw. This was personal. This was the fragile space where power met doubt. Modi stood, slowly, every movement measured. His face carried no anger, no pride, only a quiet stillness that seemed to stretch across the room. The young voices wavered slightly, as if even they were unsure of what they had unleashed. The cameras zoomed in, and in living rooms and on phones across the globe, millions of people leaned closer to their screens. And then Modi spoke. "You are right," he said, his voice calm but unshakable. "Respect must be earned. Respect is not a gift of power. It is a reflection of character. If I stand here and expect respect simply because of my position, then I do not deserve it." The words struck the hall like lightning. People shifted in their seats. Some gasped, others murmured. The young protesters who had challenged him looked startled, their defiance breaking for just a moment as they searched for what to say next. Modi continued, his eyes on them. "But remember this also. Respect is a two-way street. If you demand humility from a leader, then you must also carry humility in your heart. If you ask us to listen, then you must also be willing to hear. The moment we reduce respect to a weapon, we lose the very thing that makes dialogue possible." His tone deepened, carrying the weight of someone who had lived through decades of criticism and confrontation. "I have been praised more than I deserve, and I have been insulted more than I deserve. Both are part of public life. But the real test is not what people say to me. The real test is whether I remain open to the truth hidden inside their words. Sometimes respect is not applause. Sometimes respect is silence. Sometimes respect is the courage to listen even when the words hurt." The hall fell into a heavy quiet once again. Sundar watched Modi carefully, his heart tightening. He could see the truth in what Modi was saying, but he could also sense the deep pain behind it, the pain of a man who had carried the burden of leadership, who had been both adored and despised, and who now stood vulnerable before a sea of watching eyes. The young people did not back down entirely. The one in front, a girl with fierce determination in her face, spoke again. "If you truly believe respect must be earned, then show it. Show it not with words, but with actions. Words are easy. Actions are harder." Her challenge rang clear, and suddenly the hall felt like it had become a courtroom, with every person waiting to see how Modi would defend himself. The Prime Minister nodded slowly, almost as if he had expected the challenge. "You are right again," Modi said softly. "Words are easy. Actions are harder. And it is true that leaders are judged by what they do, not only by what they say. But let me tell you this. Every leader is also a human being. And sometimes actions take time. Sometimes what looks like silence is work being done behind the curtain. Respect comes not from perfection, but from persistence." For a long moment the hall was frozen. People could not tell whether the confrontation had ended or only grown sharper. Sundar felt the tension pulling at him, tugging at his own heart. He had tried to calm the storm once already, but he knew now that something deeper was happening here. It was not just about respect. It was about the struggle every generation faces, between the past and the future, between authority and rebellion. between patience and urgency, and Sundar, standing between the Prime Minister and the young challengers, realized that his role was no longer just to support or defend. His role was to build a bridge where there seemed to be none. He stepped forward again, his calm voice rising above the heavy silence. "I hear both sides," Sundar said, "and what I hear is not simply anger. I hear the pain of the young who feel unseen, and I hear the weight of a leader who carries responsibility far heavier than most can imagine. But let us not mistake this moment. This is not a battle to be won. This is an opportunity to understand." He turned toward the young people, his eyes gentle. "You are right to demand that respect must be earned. Do not lose that fire. But also remember that even leaders are human. They bleed, they struggle, they doubt. And if we demand perfection from them, we set them up to fail. What we must demand instead is honesty, humility, and the courage to change. That is how respect is built. Not in one night, not in one speech, but in years of dialogue." The crowd stirred, caught between reflection and unease. Sundar's words were not a resolution, but they were a thread, a thin thread of connection where only division had been moments earlier. But just as it seemed the tension might finally ease, a sudden commotion erupted near the side of the hall. Security guards rushed toward the noise, and a figure broke through the line. A man, younger than the first protester, his face filled with rage. He shouted words that were hard to catch at first, but soon his voice rang clear. "Enough of these games. Enough of these speeches. Respect is not the issue. Truth is the issue. Tell us the truth about what is hidden. Tell us what you are not saying." The hall plunged into chaos again. People shouted. Security moved in closer, the camera's word focusing on the disruption. Sundar felt his pulse quicken. Modi turned, his expression hardening for the first time that night. And in that moment, Sundar knew the night had shifted again. It was no longer only about respect, no longer only about kindness or cruelty. It was about something far more dangerous: truth, and the secrets that people believed were being kept from them. And as the young man pushed forward, his voice shaking with fury, Sundar realized something that sent a chill down his spine. This confrontation was not spontaneous. It was planned. The weight of hidden truths, the commotion at the side of the hall, spread like ripples in water. Chairs scraped against the polished floor as people turned, their faces tightening with unease. The young man who had forced his way forward was breathing heavily, his fists clenched, his eyes burning with a mix of fear and fury. Security guards tried to stop him, but his voice pierced through the noise before they could silence him. "Enough of these polished words," he shouted. "Enough of these rehearsed speeches. You talk about respect, about kindness, about humility, but none of it matters if truth is hidden. People suffer, people struggle, and all we get are carefully chosen lines. Where is the honesty? Where's the courage to tell us what really happens behind closed doors?" The hall erupted into whispers, gasps, even a few cheers. Some nodded at his words, while others shook their heads, disapproving of the disruption. Sundar felt the energy shift again. This was no longer just a conversation about respect. This was becoming something heavier, something that touched the very heart of trust itself. Prime Minister Modi's face hardened, though his body remained still. He was no stranger to accusations, but the sharpness of the young man's words cut through the hall with unusual force. Sundar, standing between them, felt the moment pulling him like a current. And in that instant, memories from his own journey surged inside him. He remembered his early days in America, when he was just another student among thousands, a foreigner carrying dreams larger than his means. He remembered watching people argue about leaders, about truth, about power, and realizing that truth itself often becomes a battlefield where no one leaves unscathed. The young man's voice rose again, shaking with passion. "We are told to respect leaders, to respect institutions, but how can we respect what we do not trust? Truth is the foundation of respect, and without it, everything else is empty. Tell us the truth, here, now, in front of all these people. Or admit that respect is just another performance." The challenge landed heavy in the hall like a stone thrown into still water. People leaned forward in their seats. The cameras zoomed closer and Sundar felt the weight of eyes not only on Modi, but also on himself. For a moment, silence stretched. Sundar knew this was the most dangerous silence of the night, because silence, in moments like this, does not feel like calm. It feels like pressure, like something about to break. He glanced at Modi, who remained unmoving, his face unreadable. Sundar realized the Prime Minister was choosing not to respond immediately, perhaps calculating, perhaps waiting. But in that hesitation, the young man grew louder, his words striking sharper. If truth is so difficult to speak, then why should we respect you? Why should we believe anything said here tonight? Respect without truth is just a mask. And masks always fall. The words cut deep, not only at Modi but at the entire atmosphere of the evening. Sundar's breath quickened. He knew that if something was not said now, the hall would collapse into chaos, and respect, the very theme of this gathering, would be torn apart. Taking a step forward, Sundar raised his hand slightly, a gesture both to calm the young man and to signal to the audience. His voice, when it came, was steady but filled with a quiet gravity. "You are right to demand truth," Sundar said, his tone neither defensive nor accusatory. "Truth is not decoration. Truth is the foundation on which respect stands. Without it, respect collapses like a house of cards. But truth is not always simple. Sometimes truth is too vast to fit in a single answer. Sometimes it is too heavy to be carried in one night." The young man glared, but his breathing slowed as if Sundar's calmness had created a pause in his fury. Sundar continued, his words now flowing with the weight of his own life. "When I was young, I thought truth was a clear thing. One side right, the other wrong. But the older I grew, the more I realized that truth often hides in shades, not in black and white. Leaders carry truths that are tangled with responsibility, with fear, with consequences that reach millions. It is not always cowardice when they hold silence. Sometimes it is the struggle of carrying truths too heavy for the moment. And yet I believe that silence cannot last forever. Truth must come, and it always does in time." The hall grew still again, caught in the tension of Sundar's words. Some people nodded slowly while others frowned, unconvinced. The young man shook his head. "You speak well, Sundar," he said bitterly. "But words are still words. When will we see actions? When will leaders stop hiding behind the excuse of too heavy for now? When will the truth actually reach the people?" His voice cracked at the end, revealing something beyond anger, pain, exhaustion, even desperation. Sundar felt it. Everyone in the hall felt it. This was not just a protest. This was the cry of someone who had carried disappointment for too long. Before Sundar could respond, Modi finally moved. His voice, when it came, was low and deliberate, each word measured. "Truth is not hidden because we fear the people," Modi said. "Sometimes truth is guarded because once released it cannot be controlled. It can heal, but it can also burn. It can unite, but it can also divide. And the responsibility of leadership is not only to speak truth, but to decide how much truth can be carried by the people at a given time." His words landed heavily, filling the hall with an even greater tension. Some in the audience nodded in agreement, but many shifted uncomfortably, as if unsure whether to accept or resist what they had just heard. Sundar's mind raced. He understood the weight of Modi's words, but he also saw the danger, because what Modi had admitted, even if cautiously, could be seen as validation of the young man's accusation, that truth was indeed being withheld. The young man's eyes widened, his body trembling with a mix of anger and vindication. "So you admit it," he said, his voice rising, echoing through the hall. "You admit that truth is being kept from us. Then how can you expect respect? How can you expect loyalty? You build walls of silence and you call it leadership. But we call it betrayal." The room erupted into shouts, gasps, confusion. People argued, voices overlapping. The event that was meant to celebrate unity and vision was unraveling into chaos, and Sundar, standing in the center of it all, felt the storm pressing on him like never before. He knew that if he did not act now, the evening would end not with inspiration, but with division, anger, and distrust. He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing on every memory of struggle, of resilience, of kindness. He remembered his father's words about respect. He remembered his mother's belief in kindness as a seed. He remembered the countless times he had been underestimated, and the choice he had made not to respond with bitterness. When he opened his eyes, his voice was calm but powerful, carrying through the hall with clarity. Maybe tonight is not about speeches. Maybe tonight is not about answers. Maybe tonight is about questions that cut us open, questions we do not want to face. Maybe respect is not built in moments when we agree, but in moments when we dare to stand in the fire of disagreement without turning it into hatred. If we cannot do that, then respect is meaningless. The hall quieted, not completely, but enough that people listened. The young man stared at Sundar, breathing heavily, caught between anger and something softer. Modi watched silently, his eyes unreadable, his body still as stone. And then, from somewhere in the audience, a voice whispered just loud enough to be heard. "What if the truth you fear to speak is the very thing that could heal us?" The word sent a chill through the hall. Sundar felt it in his bones. Modi stiffened. The young man's eyes blazed with renewed fire. And Sundar knew the night was not ending here. The real storm was only beginning. The crack in the silence, the whisper that cut through the hall. What if the truth you fear to speak is the very thing that could heal us? Lingered in the air like smoke after fire. It was not loud, yet it was powerful enough to shift the entire atmosphere. People turned in their seats, searching for the source of the voice, but it was impossible to tell who had spoken. It seemed to come from everywhere, from the very walls of the grand hall, from the collective heart of the audience. Sundar Pichai felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had heard thousands of questions in his life, but this one was different. This was not an attack. It was not anger. It was a plea, raw and aching, as if it came from the soul of a nation itself. The young man who had forced his way forward froze at the words. His fury, which had burned so hot, now flickered like a flame struggling against wind. His eyes darted between Modi, Sundar, and the crowd, as if trying to understand whether he had allies or whether he stood alone. Modi's posture stiffened, his jaw tightening. For the first time that night, his silence looked less like control and more like burden. Sundar saw it, the weight pressing on him, the invisible walls of leadership closing in. It was a heavy thing to stand as a symbol, to be demanded of, to be questioned, to be adored, and to be despised. All at once, Sundar took a slow step forward, his voice steady, carrying the calm that had always been his strength. "Truth has a way of pressing on us," he said. "We may hide it, we may delay it, but it waits. And when it is not spoken, it grows heavier until it breaks us. But I also know this. Truth spoken without compassion can destroy. Truth spoken with respect has the power to heal. What matters is not only what we say, but how we say it." The hall quieted slightly, the restless murmurs softening. Sundar's words wrapped around the tension like a fragile thread, but everyone knew it could snap at any moment. The young man's voice shook as he spoke again. "Then say it. If truth can heal, let it be spoken tonight. Let the silence end. Let us hear what has been hidden." The demand hung in the air, heavier than before. Sundar's heart pounded. He knew the responsibility was not his to reveal government secrets, nor was it his place to expose truths he did not fully know. But he also knew the crowd was looking at him, not just Modi, as though he had become the voice between the people and the leader. And then, to the shock of everyone, Modi finally moved. His voice came slowly, deliberately, carrying the gravity of someone who had carried a secret too long. "You ask for truth," he said. "You believe it is being hidden. And perhaps you are right. Perhaps there are truths we have feared to speak, because we believed they would divide us. But maybe the greater danger is not in speaking them, but in remaining silent." Gasps filled the hall. Sundar's chest tightened. Modi's tone was not defensive. It was not the voice of a man denying accusations. It was the voice of a man on the edge of revelation. He continued, There are challenges this nation faces, challenges deeper than what you see in the news, heavier than what speeches can hold. Poverty, inequality, the struggles of the powerless, yes, they remain, even when we speak of progress. We celebrate technology, but millions still live without light. We speak of opportunity, but many still feel unseen. This is truth. And, if I have not spoken of it enough, it is not because I deny it. It is because sometimes as leaders we fear that naming the wound too loudly will make it bleed more. But perhaps I was wrong. The hall shifted, the anger softening into something else, a quiet sorrow, a recognition of reality. The young man who had shouted earlier now stood trembling, his defiance breaking under the weight of words that were not excuses but confessions. Sundar felt his heart ache. He knew what it meant to live unseen. He had been the boy sitting at the back of the classroom, quiet, unnoticed. He had been the young man struggling to be heard in foreign lands. He had been the CEO questioned for being too humble, too silent, too soft. And now, he saw in Modi not the untouchable symbol of power, but a human being carrying the same fear, the fear of not being enough. He stepped closer to Modi, not as an ally defending him, nor as a challenger opposing him, but as a bridge. "The truth you just spoke," Sundar said softly, "is not weakness. It is strength. When we name the wound, we do not make it worse. We begin to heal it. Respect grows not from pretending all is perfect, but from admitting what is broken and working together to mend it." The audience listened, many with tears in their eyes. What had begun as a night of confrontation was slowly transforming into something else. Not resolution, not yet, but a fragile honesty that felt more real than anything before. But just when the hall seemed to settle, another twist arrived. A woman's voice rang out from the back, sharper than the whispers before. Words again, always words. "Do you think honesty alone is enough? Do you think confession heals the hungry? Truth is only the first step. What will you do?" The hall stirred again. Sundar turned, his chest tightening once more. He knew she was right. Truth was powerful, but it was not enough without action. Modi's confession had opened a door, but the crowd wanted to walk through it, not just look inside. Modi's eyes darkened, his expression tightening. He did not answer immediately. Sundar realized the moment was tilting again, threatening to collapse under the weight of impatience, and he felt it. The next step was his. The hall, the cameras, the people, even Modi himself. All eyes turned to Sundar, waiting for his response. He took a deep breath, knowing that whatever he said next would shape not just the night, but the memory of it for everyone who had witnessed it. And then, with his voice steady and clear, he began to speak, not as a CEO, not as a politician, but as a man who had lived through struggle, who knew the meaning of respect, humility, resilience, and kindness. But before he could finish his first sentence, the hall went dark. The lights above flickered violently, then died, plunging the grand stage and the audience into sudden blackness. Gasps echoed. People shouted. The cameras cut off. In the darkness, someone's voice rang out, cold, deliberate, and filled with menace. "Truth has its price." The light in the silence, the blackout swallowed the hall in a suffocating darkness. The great lights that only moments before had made the stage feel like the center of the world were gone, leaving only the shallow echoes of panic. People gasped, voices rose in fear, chairs scraped loudly against the floor as some tried to stand, others tried to move, and the once orderly gathering dissolved into chaos. Sundar Pichai stood frozen for a moment, his eyes wide, his heart racing in his chest. The sudden shift from light to shadow felt like a metaphor made real. The fragile thread of truth and respect they had been weaving was torn apart in an instant. Then came the voice, cutting through the darkness, cold and sharp like a blade. "Truth has its price." The words sent a shiver through the hall. They were not shouted, not frantic. They were deliberate, heavy, filled with menace. The sound carried not only through the ears but into the bones. as if warning every person present that something much larger, much darker, was at play. Modi remained still in the darkness. Sundar could feel his presence near him, steady and unmoving, but for the first time that evening he sensed fear. Not the fear of a man, but the fear of what might happen when a room full of fragile human beings is plunged into confusion and uncertainty. People whispered, some prayed, others shouted. For security, the heavy boots of guards rushed to corners of the hall, flashlights flickering to life, cutting small shapes of brightness into the thick black. But the voice did not return. Whoever had spoken had vanished into the anonymity of shadow. Sundar breathed deeply, forcing his heartbeat to slow. He had always lived by calmness, by patience, by the quiet strength of humility. And now he realized calmness was the only anchor left in the storm. He raised his voice, steady, clear, echoing against the walls. Stay calm, please. Stay calm. We are safe. Let us not let fear control us. The audience quieted slightly, their panic softening into uneasy murmurs. Sundar's words, though simple, carried a power they had not expected. In the absence of light, it was his voice that became the guide. After a long moment, backup lights flickered on. They were weak, dim emergency lamps, but they were enough to paint the hall in a dull, amber glow. The stage was visible again, the faces of the crowd slowly emerging from shadow. The fear had not left, but it had lessened. Modi finally spoke, his voice low but firm. Let us not be shaken by those who hide in darkness. Fear thrives in silence. We must answer it not with fear, but with courage. His words steadied the hall further, but Sundar could feel the question pressing in on every heart. What did that voice mean? Was it a threat? A warning? A declaration that truth, if spoken, would cost too much? The young man who had demanded truth earlier now stood pale, trembling. He looked less like a challenger and more like a witness to something he did not fully understand. Sundar walked toward him, his step slow, his eyes soft. Do not let fear take away your voice, Sundar said gently. Those who speak in shadows want us to stop talking. They want us to stop listening. But we will not give them that victory. The young man nodded slowly, his anger from before, replaced with something else, gratitude, even trust. Sundar turned back to the hall. His voice grew stronger, filling the space with a new kind of fire. We came here tonight to talk about respect. We thought it was about leaders and citizens, about kindness and cruelty, about power and humility. But tonight has shown us something deeper. Respect is also about how we face fear together. It is about how we carry truth not when it is easy, but when it is dangerous. If we give up now, if we allow darkness to win, then everything we have spoken means nothing.